She cared for her neighbor's elderly mother for 15 years, until she discovered the hidden fortune meant for her. Ava Sinclair stood at the kitchen sink, the warm water running over her hands as she washed the dishes from breakfast. The sun streamed through the window, illuminating the small kitchen in her modest home. It was a routine she had grown accustomed to over the years, but today felt different. Today marked 15 years since she had begun caring for Mrs. Carter, her elderly neighbor, and the weight of that milestone pressed heavily on her heart. Another day, another dish, Ava murmured to herself, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She glanced out the window toward the Carter residence, where Mrs. Carter had lived for decades. The house was a charming old Victorian, its paint peeling and the garden overgrown, but it held a wealth of memories for Ava. Mrs. Carter had been a vibrant woman once, full of stories and laughter, but as the years passed, dementia had taken its toll, stealing away the woman Ava had come to love like family. Ava had stepped in when Leo, Mrs. Carter's son, had moved away for work, leaving his mother in need of care. What had started as a simple favor had blossomed into a deep bond, one that Ava cherished even as it drained her emotionally and physically. "Time to check on her," Ava said, drying her hands on a dish towel. She grabbed her bag and headed out the door, her heart heavy with the knowledge that today would be particularly difficult. As she walked the short distance to the Carter home, memories flooded her mind. She remembered the first time she had met Mrs. Carter, a sprightly woman with a twinkle in her eye, who had welcomed Ava with open arms. "You're a blessing, dear," Mrs. Carter had said, her voice warm and inviting. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Now, as Ava approached the front porch, she felt a pang of sadness. The vibrant woman she had known was now a shadow of her former self, often lost in her own thoughts, her eyes clouded with confusion. Ava knocked gently on the door, and after a moment, it creaked open. "Hello, Mrs. Carter," Ava said softly, stepping inside. The familiar scent of lavender filled the air, a fragrance Mrs. Carter had always loved. "It's me, Ava." "Ah, Ava, my dear," Mrs. Carter replied, her voice shaky but filled with warmth. "You're here. I was just thinking about you." Ava's heart swelled at the recognition. "I'm here to help you with breakfast. How about some oatmeal today?" "Yes, please," Mrs. Carter said, her smile brightening the dim room. "And maybe some of that lovely fruit you brought last week?" "Of course," Ava replied, moving to the kitchen. As she prepared the meal, she couldn't help but steal glances at Mrs. Carter, who sat at the table, her hands trembling slightly as she fiddled with a napkin. "Do you remember when we used to bake cookies together?" Ava asked, trying to spark a memory. Mrs. Carter's brow furrowed, and for a moment, Ava feared she had lost her. But then a flicker of recognition crossed her face. "Oh, the chocolate chip ones. You always added too many chocolate chips, dear." Ava chuckled, her heart lifting. "I thought it was the best part." They shared a moment of laughter, and for a brief instant, the weight of the years seemed to lift. But as breakfast continued, the conversation drifted, and Ava could see the confusion creeping back into Mrs. Carter's eyes. It was a painful reminder of the reality they faced. After breakfast, Ava helped Mrs. Carter to the living room, where she settled into her favorite armchair, a patchwork of colors that had seen better days. Ava sat across from her, the sunlight streaming through the window, casting a warm glow over the room. "Mrs. Carter, do you remember what day it is today?" Ava asked gently, hoping to keep her engaged. "Is it my birthday?" Mrs. Carter replied, her eyes brightening. "Not quite, but it's a special day," Ava said, her heart heavy with the truth. "It's been 15 years since I started helping you." 15 years, Mrs. Carter echoed, her brow furrowing. "That's a long time, dear." "Yes, it is," Ava said, her voice softening, "and I wouldn't trade it for anything." As the morning wore on, Ava helped Mrs. Carter with her daily exercises, guiding her through simple movements that had become routine. But as they worked, Ava's mind wandered to the future. She had dedicated so much of her life to caring for Mrs. Carter, and now, with Leo's return imminent, she felt a sense of unease. Leo had been distant for years, only returning for brief visits, often leaving Ava to shoulder the burden of care alone. She had always respected his decisions, but now, with Mrs. Carter's health declining, Ava wondered how Leo would react to the changes. Would he appreciate the bond they had formed, or would he see Ava as an intruder in his mother's life? Just as Ava was lost in thought, the doorbell rang, jolting her back to reality. "I'll get it," she said, rising from her seat. As she opened the door, she was greeted by the sight of Leo Carter, his tall frame silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun. "Hey, Ava," Leo said, his voice casual but his eyes betraying a hint of tension. "I just got back into town." "Hi, Leo," Ava replied, forcing a smile. "I was just helping your mother with her exercises." "Is she doing okay?" Leo asked, stepping inside. Ava hesitated, weighing her words carefully. "She's had some good moments today, but it's been tough. You know how it is." Leo nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, I know. I've been busy with work, but I'm here now. I'll take over from here." Ava felt a pang of frustration. "Leo, I've been caring for her every day. I think it would be best if we worked together." He waved a dismissive hand. "I appreciate what you've done, but I can handle it now. I'm her son." Ava's heart raced as she felt the tension rising. "You can't just walk in and expect everything to be fine. She needs continuity, Leo. She needs both of us." Leo's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Ava feared the conversation would escalate. "I'll do what I need to do," he said, his tone sharp. "I'm not here to discuss this." Ava took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. "I just want what's best for Mrs. Carter. She deserves that." Leo's expression softened slightly, but the tension remained. "I'll take care of it, Ava. You've done enough." As he turned to head toward the living room, Ava felt a mix of anger and sadness. She had poured her heart into caring for Mrs. Carter, and now it felt as if Leo was dismissing her efforts. But she also knew that this was just the beginning. With Leo back in town, the dynamics were shifting, and she had to prepare for whatever lay ahead. After a few moments of silence, Ava returned to the kitchen, her mind racing. She had dedicated her life to Mrs. Carter, and now, with Leo's return, she felt as if everything she had built was at risk. The thought of losing the bond she had formed with Mrs. Carter was unbearable. As she washed the dishes, her thoughts drifted to the hidden will she had discovered while sorting through Mrs. Carter's belongings. It had been a shock, a revelation that had turned her world upside down. The will indicated that Mrs. Carter had left a significant fortune meant for Ava, a gesture of gratitude for the years of care and companionship. But now, with Leo back, Ava felt the weight of that discovery pressing down on her. Would she have the courage to confront him about it? Would she risk their relationship for what was rightfully hers? The dilemma gnawed at her, and she knew she had to make a decision soon. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the kitchen, Ava felt a sense of resolve building within her. She had cared for Mrs. Carter with love and dedication, and she wouldn't let Leo's return overshadow that. She would find a way to honor Mrs. Carter's legacy, even if it meant standing up to Leo. With a deep breath, Ava made her way back to the living room, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. She would not back down. She would fight for what was right, for the woman who had become like family to her. Ava Sinclair steadied herself as she stepped into the living room, where Leo had settled into an armchair, his posture rigid. The air was thick with unspoken words, and a tension simmered just beneath the surface. She could see Mrs. Carter in the background, gazing out the window, her expression distant and lost. "Are you going to talk to her?" Ava asked, her voice firm yet gentle. She needed Leo to understand the importance of maintaining the connection with his mother. Leo glanced at Mrs. Carter, his brow furrowing. "I'll talk to her later. Right now, I just got in. I need to get my bearings." Ava felt frustration bubbling up inside her. "Leo, she needs you to engage with her. Just being here isn't enough. She doesn't understand why you've been gone for so long." "Maybe she wouldn't have to understand if you hadn't taken it upon yourself to become her full-time caregiver," Leo shot back, his voice laced with irritation. Ava's heart raced at the accusation. "I didn't take anything from you, Leo. You left. I just wanted to ensure your mother was taken care of." He opened his mouth to respond, but the words died on his lips. Instead, he looked away, his jaw tightening. Ava could see the internal struggle playing out behind his eyes, a mix of guilt and resentment that she had come to recognize all too well. "Let's just focus on her for now," Leo said finally, his tone softer. "I'm here now, and I want to do right by her." Ava nodded, swallowing her frustration. "That's all I want too, but it's going to take both of us." As the evening unfolded, they both took turns engaging Mrs. Carter in conversation. Ava recounted stories of the past, of happy moments spent baking cookies and watching old movies. Leo sat quietly, occasionally chiming in with a memory that seemed to surprise even him. It was a delicate dance, one that required both of them to bridge the gap that had widened in his absence. "Do you remember our trip to the beach?" Ava asked Mrs. Carter, hoping to spark a flicker of recognition. "You wore that lovely blue dress, and we made sandcastles all day." Mrs. Carter's eyes brightened momentarily. "The sandcastles! Oh, how I loved to build them!" she exclaimed, her voice filled with enthusiasm. The warmth of the memory lit up her face, and for a moment, it felt as though the years had melted away. "See, Leo?" Ava said, her voice tinged with hope. "She remembers. We can still connect through those memories." Leo nodded, a hint of admiration creeping into his expression. "Yeah, I see that. I guess I've been so focused on the future that I forgot about the past." Ava smiled, encouraged by the progress they were making. "It's never too late to reconnect. We just need to keep reminding her of the good times." As the evening wore on, Leo began to relax, allowing himself to engage more with his mother. Ava felt a sense of relief wash over her as she watched the two of them share laughter, the bond slowly mending in front of her eyes. But even as the warmth filled the room, a nagging thought lingered at the back of her mind, the hidden will. Later that night, after Leo had left to run some errands, Ava found herself alone with Mrs. Carter, who had grown quiet and contemplative. Ava took a seat beside her, holding her hand gently. "Mrs. Carter," Ava said softly, "I need to talk to you about something important." Mrs. Carter turned her gaze toward Ava, her eyes clouded but attentive. "What is it, dear?" Ava hesitated, unsure of how to approach the topic. It's about the future and what's left behind. I found something in your things. A will. Mrs. Carter's brow furrowed, and for a moment, Ava was unsure if she had made the right choice. A will? She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Ava continued, her heart racing. It states that you left something for me, a fortune. It's significant, and I think it's important that we discuss it. Mrs. Carter blinked slowly, as if processing the information. I don't remember, she admitted, her voice trembling. I don't recall making any decisions. It's okay, Ava said gently, squeezing her hand. You've been through so much, and I promise to honor your wishes, but I need to know how you feel about it. Are you still comfortable with what you left behind? Mrs. Carter's eyes filled with tears, and Ava felt a rush of compassion. I wanted to thank you for everything you've done for me, Ava. You've been my light in the darkness. Ava's heart swelled at the praise, but a knot of anxiety twisted in her stomach. But Leo is your son. He may not understand why you chose to leave the fortune to me. Mrs. Carter took a deep breath, her gaze steadying. You've been more than a caregiver, Ava. You've been family. Leo, he's lost his way. He needs to learn what it means to care for someone. Ava nodded, her resolve strengthening. I'll fight for it, Mrs. Carter. I promise I won't let anyone take away what you wanted for me. As they continued to talk late into the night, Ava felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, especially with Leo's return. But she was determined to stand her ground and honor Mrs. Carter's legacy. The next morning, as Ava prepared for the day, she felt a mix of anxiety and excitement. She had to confront Leo about the will, and though she dreaded the confrontation, she knew it was necessary. The thought of losing what Mrs. Carter had intended for her fueled her determination. After breakfast, Ava took a moment to gather her thoughts. The sun streamed through the window, illuminating the room and filling her with a sense of hope. She had spent so many years caring for Mrs. Carter, and now it was time to stand up for herself and the legacy of love that the elderly woman had left behind. When Leo arrived later that morning, Ava felt a knot tighten in her stomach. He walked in with an air of authority, his demeanor businesslike as he approached her. Have you spoken to Mom today? Leo asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. Yes, I have, Ava replied, her heart racing. And I need to discuss something important with you. Leo raised an eyebrow, a hint of skepticism in his expression. What is it? Ava took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation. It's about Mrs. Carter's will. I found a hidden document that states she left a fortune for me. Leo's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing. What do you mean? She left money for you? That doesn't make any sense. It makes perfect sense if you consider everything I've done for her over the years, Ava said, her voice steady. I've been here for her when you weren't. This isn't just about the money. It's about the love and care I provided. Leo's face flushed with anger. You think you can just waltz in here and claim what's mine? She's my mother. Leo, you've been absent for so long, Ava replied, her frustration boiling over. You can't just come back and take everything without acknowledging what I've done for her. Did you ever think that maybe I don't want you to have anything? That you're just a caretaker, not a family member? His voice was cold, cutting through the air like ice. Ava felt her heart race, the confrontation escalating beyond her expectations. I cared for your mother with my whole heart. She saw me as family, and I won't let you take that away from me. Leo stood frozen, his expression torn between anger and disbelief. The tension in the room crackled, filling the air with a thick uncertainty. I'll fight for this, Ava declared, her voice unwavering. You may be her son, but that doesn't give you the right to dismiss everything I've done. As she spoke, Ava felt a surge of strength coursing through her. She had dedicated her life to Mrs. Carter, and she wouldn't let anyone, not even Leo, take that away. Ava Sinclair stood her ground, her heart pounding as she faced Leo Carter, whose expression had shifted from anger to disbelief. The tension in the room was palpable, thickening the air between them as the reality of their confrontation sank in. Ava had never intended for things to escalate so quickly, but she could feel the fire of her emotions pushing her forward. You think you can just come in here after all these years and claim what's mine? Leo shot back, his voice rising. You're not family, Ava. You were just a caregiver. The words stung, but Ava refused to back down. I was more than that, Leo. I was there for your mother when you weren't. I was there for her when she needed someone to care for her, to love her. You might be her son, but that doesn't give you the right to dismiss everything I've done. Leo's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Ava wondered if he would lash out further, but he seemed to be grappling with his own emotions, his expression shifting from anger to something more vulnerable. You don't understand, he said quietly. You don't know what it's like to have the burden of responsibility. Responsibility? Ava echoed, incredulous. You left her to me. You abandoned her. I've carried that burden for years, and it's taken a toll on me. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in his posture. I was busy building a career. I thought she'd be fine. I thought I could come back and fix everything. Fix everything? Ava scoffed, shaking her head. You can't just fix the years you've missed. Caregiving isn't a job you can clock in and out of. It's a commitment, and I was there every day. I loved her like family. Leo's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Ava feared she had crossed a line. You think your feelings make you more deserving, he snapped. This is my inheritance, my mother's money. You don't get to just take that from me. Maybe if you had been present, you would have had a say in her wishes, Ava replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. But you weren't. And now it's time for you to face the consequences of your absence. The silence that followed was deafening. Leo's anger simmered, his fists clenched at his sides, while Ava felt a rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had fought for Mrs. Carter's dignity and care for years, and she would not allow Leo's entitlement to overshadow that. Look, I didn't come here to fight, Leo said, his voice lower now, almost pleading. I just want to understand what Mom wanted. I want to know why she would leave you anything. Ava took a deep breath, feeling the intensity of the moment shift slightly. She left me the fortune because of the love and care I provided, Leo. It wasn't just about the money. It was about gratitude. She saw me as family when you weren't around. Leo's expression softened, and for a moment, Ava caught a glimpse of the man he could be, the man who could acknowledge his mother's wishes and the impact of his absence. I didn't know, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize how much she depended on you. Ava felt a flicker of hope. This can be a new beginning for us, Leo. We can honor your mother's legacy together, but you need to accept that I played a vital role in her life. Leo nodded slowly, his eyes searching hers. I don't want to lose her memory, Ava. I want to do right by her. Then let's work together, Ava urged, her heart racing. Let's find a way to honor her wishes and keep her spirit alive. We can turn this into something beautiful. As the conversation continued, Ava felt the tension between them begin to dissipate. They discussed the possibility of establishing a community project in Mrs. Carter's name, something that would benefit others and reflect her spirit of kindness and generosity. If we use the fortune for good, Leo suggested, it could be a way to honor her memory. Ava smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. Exactly. We could create a community center, a place where people can gather, learn, and grow, just like your mother wanted. As they began to brainstorm ideas, the atmosphere shifted from confrontation to collaboration. They exchanged thoughts on what the community center could offer: classes, support groups, and activities for all ages. Ava felt a renewed sense of purpose, and she could see Leo warming to the idea of working together. However, even amidst their newfound camaraderie, Ava couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Leo's intentions might still be clouded by his past. She had seen glimpses of his anger and entitlement, and she knew she had to tread carefully. Leo, I want to believe that we can do this together, Ava said, her voice steady. But you need to understand that this isn't just about the money. It's about honoring your mother's wishes and preserving her legacy. If we're going to do this, it has to come from a genuine place. Leo nodded, his expression contemplative. I get it. I'll make sure to approach this with respect. I won't let my past mistakes define our future. As they continued to discuss their vision for the community center, Ava felt the weight of her worries begin to lift. They were piecing together a plan that could create something positive, a way to honor Mrs. Carter's memory, while also forging a new bond between them. The evening wore on, and as they wrapped up their conversation, Ava felt a sense of clarity settling in her heart. This was a turning point, not just for her, but for Leo as well. They had the opportunity to create something lasting, a legacy that would reflect the love and kindness that Mrs. Carter had embodied. Let's meet again tomorrow to discuss this further, Leo suggested, a hint of excitement creeping into his voice. I'd like that, Ava replied, a smile breaking through her earlier tension. Let's make sure we do this right. After Leo left, Ava took a moment to reflect on the day's events. The confrontation had been intense, but it had also opened the door for a new beginning. She felt a mixture of hope and trepidation as she thought about the journey ahead. But as she prepared for bed, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that the hidden will was still a looming shadow over their plans. While Leo seemed willing to collaborate, she knew that the true test of their partnership would come when it was time to act on Mrs. Carter's wishes. The next morning brought a sense of resolve. Ava decided to dig deeper into the will and prepare herself for what lay ahead. She needed to understand everything Mrs. Carter had intended for her and ensure that they would honor her legacy as a team. As Ava settled into her routine, she found herself reflecting on the years she had spent caring for Mrs. Carter. Each memory was filled with love, laughter, and challenges, and she knew that the journey wouldn't end here. There would be obstacles ahead, but she was determined to face them head-on. Later that day, Ava decided to visit the local courthouse to gather more information about the will. The sun shone brightly as she walked, and the bustling streets filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. She had devoted her life to Mrs. Carter, and she was ready to fight for what was rightfully hers. Arriving at the courthouse, Ava felt the familiar sense of anxiety wash over her as she approached the clerk's desk. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady. "I need to access the will of Mrs. Carter." The clerk nodded, typing on the computer. Do you have the case number? Not yet, but I can provide her full name, Ava replied, her heart racing. It's Mrs. Ruth Carter. The clerk paused, her fingers stilling on the keyboard. Give me a moment. As Ava waited, she felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. She hoped to uncover more details about the fortune Mrs. Carter had left behind, but she also felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. Would Leo's entitlement resurface, or would they find a way to work together for the greater good? After what felt like an eternity, the clerk returned with a file. I found it. Here's the will, along with the details. Ava's heart raced as she took the folder, her hands trembling slightly. Thank you. She found a quiet corner in the courthouse lobby and opened the file, scanning the pages. As she read through the details, her eyes widened in disbelief. The will clearly stated that the fortune was not only meant for her, but also stipulated that it be used to benefit the community, a directive that aligned perfectly with her vision for the community center. A sense of relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by a surge of determination. This was her chance to not only claim what was rightfully hers, but to honor Mrs. Carter's legacy in a way that would resonate throughout the community. Ava knew she had to return to Leo with this information. They had a path forward, one that would require collaboration and commitment. She felt a renewed sense of purpose as she tucked the will back into the folder, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As she left the courthouse, Ava couldn't help but smile. The road ahead would be paved with obstacles, but she was prepared to face them head-on. Ava Sinclair stepped out of the courthouse, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. A sense of determination surged within her as she clutched the will tightly in her hands. The document felt like a lifeline, a bridge to the legacy Mrs. Carter had intended for her. She was ready to confront Leo again, armed with the knowledge that they had a shared purpose, even if their prior confrontation had been fraught with tension. As she made her way back to the Carter residence, Ava mentally rehearsed the conversation she would have with Leo. She would emphasize the importance of honoring Mrs. Carter's wishes, focusing on the community center they had discussed. It was time to lay the groundwork for something meaningful, something that would reflect the love and kindness Mrs. Carter had shown throughout her life. When she arrived at the house, she found Leo sitting on the porch, his head buried in his phone. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment their eyes met. Ava could see a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze, a reminder of the fragile truce they had begun to forge. "Hey," she said, trying to keep her tone light despite the weight of the moment. "I wanted to talk to you." Leo nodded, setting his phone aside. "Sure. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. I want to do right by Mom, but I'm still trying to wrap my head around everything." Ava took a seat beside him, the wooden porch creaking under their weight. "I understand. I've been thinking too. I went to the courthouse today." Leo raised an eyebrow. Curiosity piqued. "What did you find?" Ava took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "I found the will. Mrs. Carter left a significant fortune, but it's meant to be used for the community. She wanted to create a legacy that benefits others, not just us." "Really?" Leo's expression shifted, a mix of surprise and confusion crossing his face. "Are you sure? How do you know?" "Here," Ava said, opening the folder and handing it to him. "It's all written down. This is what she wanted, Leo." Leo took the document, his brow furrowing as he scanned the words. As he read, Ava felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety. She watched as his expression transitioned from disbelief to contemplation, and she held her breath, hoping he would see the potential in what Mrs. Carter had envisioned. This is Unexpected, Leo said finally, looking up from the document. I didn't know she felt this way. Neither did I, Ava admitted, her heart racing. But we can honor her legacy together. Imagine a community center where people can gather, learn, and find support. We can keep her spirit alive. Leo nodded slowly, his expression shifting as he considered the possibilities. That would be a good way to remember her, but I still don't understand why she would choose you for this. It feels unfair. Unfair, Ava echoed, frustration creeping into her voice. I dedicated years to caring for her while you were away. She saw me as family, and she wanted to ensure her legacy reflected that. It's not about favoritism. It's about the bond we formed. Leo's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Ava feared they would slip back into confrontation. But then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. I get it. I'm just grappling with this whole situation. I never thought I'd be sharing my mother's legacy with someone else. Then let's redefine what that legacy means, Ava proposed, her voice steady. We can build something that honors her memory and serves the community. Together. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the porch, Ava could see Leo's defenses starting to crumble. He was still wrestling with his emotions, but there was a flicker of openness in his eyes. Okay, he said finally, his voice softer. Let's do it. Let's create this community center. Ava felt a rush of relief and excitement. Really? You mean it? Yeah, I mean it. I want to do this for Mom, Leo replied, determination creeping into his tone. But we need to be on the same page. I don't want this to turn into a battle over her estate. I want us to work together. I agree, Ava said, her heart swelling with gratitude. This isn't about us. It's about honoring her. We'll have to communicate openly and make decisions together. As they talked, the atmosphere shifted from tension to collaboration. They brainstormed ideas for the community center, discussing potential programs and services that could benefit the neighborhood. Ava felt a renewed sense of purpose as they shaped a vision that would reflect Mrs. Carter's spirit of love and kindness. Later that evening, as they wrapped up their discussion, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that there was still a storm brewing beneath the surface. While Leo seemed committed to the idea of the community center, Ava wondered if his past motivations would resurface once the reality of the project set in. The following days passed in a blur as Ava and Leo began to take steps toward making their vision a reality. They met with community members, gathered input, and sought support from local organizations. The excitement was palpable, and Ava felt a sense of camaraderie growing between them. Together, they were crafting a legacy that would honor Mrs. Carter's memory and impact the community positively. But just as things seemed to be falling into place, an unexpected complication arose. During a meeting with a local nonprofit organization, Ava discovered that Leo had been in contact with a real estate developer who was interested in purchasing the Carter house to turn it into luxury condos. What do you mean you're considering selling the house? Ava asked, her voice rising in disbelief as they stepped out of the meeting. We just talked about the community center. Look, I'm trying to be practical, Leo replied, frustration evident in his tone. The house is old, and it's going to require a lot of money to maintain. Selling it could provide us the funds to start the center. But what about Mrs. Carter's wishes? Ava shot back, anger bubbling to the surface. She loved that house. It's part of her legacy. I'm not saying we can't honor her, Leo said, his voice tense. But we also need to be realistic about finances. We can't run a community center without funding. Ava felt her heart race as the confrontation escalated. So you're willing to sell her home for a quick buck? That's not honoring her legacy, Leo. It's exploiting it. Leo's expression hardened, and for a moment, Ava feared they were slipping back into the hostility they had worked so hard to dissipate. You're being naive, Ava. This is business. And you're forgetting that this is personal, Ava countered, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. We need to find a way to honor her memory without sacrificing everything she cherished. As the argument continued, Ava could feel the distance between them growing wider. The tension that had initially begun to fade was now creeping back in, and she realized that Leo's motivations were still clouded by the entitlement he had displayed before. Fine, let's just drop it for now, Leo said, his tone dismissive. But I'm not going to let sentimental feelings dictate our decisions. Ava felt a mixture of anger and disappointment as Leo walked away, leaving her standing on the sidewalk, her heart heavy with uncertainty. She had thought they were moving toward a shared vision, but now it seemed as though they were back at square one, grappling with the very same issues that had torn them apart before. Over the next few days, Ava tried to remain focused on their original vision for the community center, but the shadow of the house's potential sale loomed over her. She spent hours researching community centers, gathering information on funding sources, and reaching out to local residents for support. But every time she thought of Leo's dismissive attitude, a knot of frustration twisted in her stomach. One evening, as Ava sat at her kitchen table poring over documents, she received a call from one of Mrs. Carter's old friends, Tessa Ray. Tessa had been a frequent visitor during Mrs. Carter's final years and had a wealth of knowledge about the neighborhood. Ava, I heard about the community center you're planning, Tessa said, her voice warm and encouraging. I think it's a brilliant idea. We all loved Ruth, and she would want us to carry on her legacy. Thank you, Tessa, Ava replied, her heart lifting at the support. I'm trying to make it happen, but there's been some tension with Leo. He seems more focused on selling the house than honoring Mrs. Carter's wishes. There was a pause on the line, and Ava could hear Tessa's concern. That's disappointing to hear. Ruth was always about community and connection. Have you tried talking to Leo about it? I did, but he seems set on seeing the house as a liability, Ava admitted, frustration creeping back into her voice. I'm worried he's losing sight of what really matters. I know Leo can be stubborn, but you have to remind him of the love Ruth had for that home and the memories it holds, Tessa encouraged. Maybe you can bring together some of her friends for a gathering. Help him see the value of the house beyond just money. Ava considered Tessa's suggestion, feeling a flicker of hope. That's a great idea, Tessa. I'll organize something. Ava Sinclair felt a renewed sense of purpose as she hung up the phone with Tessa Ray. Organizing a gathering of Mrs. Carter's friends might just be the key to bridging the gap between her and Leo. If she could show him how deeply the community cared for Mrs. Carter and the legacy tied to her home, perhaps he would reconsider his plans to sell. The next day, Ava began to reach out to Mrs. Carter's friends, inviting them to a small gathering at the Carter residence. She wanted to create an atmosphere filled with love and nostalgia, a celebration of Mrs. Carter's life that would remind everyone of the warmth and kindness she had brought to their lives. As the day of the gathering approached, Ava worked tirelessly to prepare the house. She dusted the old furniture, arranged fresh flowers in colorful vases, and baked Mrs. Carter's favorite chocolate chip cookies, the sweet aroma filling the air like a comforting hug. She wanted everything to be perfect. When the evening arrived, the living room was alive with laughter and chatter as Mrs. Carter's friends filled the space. Tessa was the first to arrive, her warm smile instantly putting Ava at ease. This looks wonderful, Ava, she said, taking in the decorations. You really know how to honor Ruth's memory. Thank you, Tessa. I just want everyone to remember how special she was, Ava replied, her heart swelling with gratitude for the support. As more guests arrived, Ava felt the atmosphere shift. Stories began to flow, each one filled with laughter and love. They reminisced about the times Mrs. Carter had hosted book clubs, tea parties, and community gatherings that had brought everyone together. Ruth had a gift for making everyone feel welcome, one friend said, her voice warm with nostalgia. Her home was always filled with laughter and joy. Ava watched from the sidelines, a smile on her face as she absorbed the camaraderie. This was the essence of Mrs. Carter's legacy, a community built on love and connection. As the evening progressed, Ava felt a sense of accomplishment. She had created a space where memories could flourish, and she hoped Leo would see what the house represented. But just as the laughter reached its peak, Leo walked through the door, his expression unreadable. "Hey, everyone," he said, his voice a mixture of surprise and discomfort as he took in the scene. "What's going on?" "A gathering to celebrate your mother, Leo," Ava called out, her heart racing. "We're sharing stories and memories. Come join us." Leo hesitated, clearly out of his element, but as the guests beckoned him to join, he stepped further into the room. Ava could sense the tension in his shoulders, but she hoped that seeing the joy in the room would shift his perspective. As the stories continued, Ava seized the opportunity to speak directly to Leo. "You see how much everyone loves your mother, right? This house isn't just a building. It's a sanctuary filled with memories." Leo crossed his arms, his brow furrowing as he listened. "I get that, but it still needs a lot of work. You can't ignore the reality of the situation." "Reality?" Ava countered, her voice steady. "The reality is that this house holds the essence of your mother's spirit. Selling it would erase that, and I can't let that happen." Another friend chimed in. "Ruth's home has always been a gathering place for us. We need to keep it alive." Leo's expression shifted slightly, and Ava felt a glimmer of hope. "Maybe we can find a way to preserve the house and use it for the community center," he suggested hesitantly. "But we'd need funds for repairs." Ava's heart raced. "Exactly. We can hold fundraisers, apply for grants, and get the community involved. This can be a place where her spirit continues to thrive." As the evening wore on, Leo began to engage more with the guests, sharing his own memories of his mother and how much she had influenced his life. Ava watched as he slowly let down his guard, laughter spilling from his lips as he recalled moments from his childhood. But just as the atmosphere began to shift toward a more collaborative spirit, Leo's phone buzzed on the table beside him. He glanced at the screen, and his expression hardened. Ava's heart sank as she noticed the change in his demeanor. "I have to take this," Leo said abruptly, stepping outside for privacy. Ava felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She had hoped the gathering would help Leo see the value of holding onto the house, but now it felt as if the ground beneath her was shifting again. As the minutes ticked by, Ava remained inside, trying to keep the energy up among the guests. They continued to share stories, but she felt her own spirit falter, worry gnawing at her. What was Leo discussing that had pulled him away so abruptly? Eventually, Leo returned, his expression tense. "Sorry about that," he said, his tone clipped. "I need to talk to you, Ava." She nodded, sensing the urgency in his voice. "What's wrong?" Leo motioned for her to follow him outside. As they stepped onto the porch, the cool evening air wrapped around them, but the conversation felt heavy. "I just got off the phone with the developer," Leo said, his voice low. "He's offered me a good price for the house. I think I might take it." Ava's heart dropped. "After everything we just discussed? You want to sell it despite the plans we've made?" Leo's features hardened as he looked at her. This is a business decision, Ava. I can't let sentimentality dictate my choices. This is my mother's house, but it's also my financial future. Leo, this isn't just about you, Ava pleaded, desperation creeping into her voice. This house represents your mother's legacy. You're willing to throw that away for a quick profit? He crossed his arms, frustration made evident in his posture. You don't understand the pressures I'm under. I have bills to pay, and I can't afford to keep this place. It's too much. I get that, Ava replied, her voice steady. But selling it isn't the only option. We can work together to find a solution that honors your mother's memory while also being practical. Leo shook his head, his expression resolute. I've made my decision. The developer is ready to move forward, and I can't let this opportunity slip away. Ava felt the heat of anger rising within her. You're making a huge mistake, Leo. You're throwing away everything your mother valued. This house is a part of her legacy. Maybe it's time you accept that you're not in charge here, Leo snapped, his voice rising. I'm her son. I have rights. With that, he stormed back into the house, leaving Ava standing on the porch, her heart racing with a mix of anger and disappointment. She had fought so hard to create a bridge between them, and now it felt as if it had been shattered in an instant. As the gathering began to wind down, Ava felt a sense of defeat wash over her. She had hoped that by bringing everyone together, they could forge a path forward, but Leo's stubbornness and entitlement were threatening to derail everything. Later that night, as she lay in bed, Ava couldn't quiet the thoughts racing through her mind. The tension with Leo weighed heavily on her heart. She had dedicated years to caring for Mrs. Carter, and now it felt as if all of that love and commitment was being dismissed. But as she lay there, she also felt a flicker of determination returning. She wouldn't let Leo's decisions dictate the legacy Mrs. Carter had left behind. If he was unwilling to collaborate, she had to find another way to honor the elderly woman's memory. The next day, Ava took action. She gathered her thoughts and began drafting a proposal for the community center, outlining the vision, potential programs, and the impact it could have on the neighborhood. She wanted to present it to local organizations and see if they would be willing to support her efforts, whether Leo was on board or not. As she worked tirelessly, Ava reached out to community members, gathering input and support. The more she spoke about Mrs. Carter's vision, the more people rallied around her. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about preserving a legacy of love and kindness that had touched so many lives. She knew that if Leo wouldn't see the value in honoring his mother's wishes, she would have to forge ahead without him. After all, Mrs. Carter had always believed in the power of community, a lesson Ava would carry with her as she fought for what was right. A few days later, Ava arranged a meeting with the local nonprofit organization that had shown interest in supporting her vision. As she prepared her presentation, she felt a surge of hope. She was ready to prove that the community center could become a reality, one that would honor Mrs. Carter's memory and serve as a beacon of hope for the neighborhood. When the day of the meeting arrived, Ava felt a mix of nerves and excitement. She stood in front of a small group of board members, her heart racing as she shared her vision for the community center. This isn't just about a building, Ava said, her voice steady. It's about creating a safe space for our community to gather, learn, and grow. It's about honoring the legacy of Ruth Carter, a woman who dedicated her life to caring for others. As she spoke passionately about the programs they could offer, cooking classes, support groups, art workshops, the board members listened intently. Ava Sinclair stood before the board members of the local nonprofit, her heart pounding in her chest as she shared her vision for the community center. Each word felt like a lifeline, connecting her to the legacy of Mrs. Carter and the community that had rallied around her. She spoke with passion, revealing the plans for a space that would not only honor the memory of an extraordinary woman, but also create a haven for those in need. This center will be a place where we can build relationships, share resources, and provide support for one another, Ava declared, her voice steady and strong. Ruth Carter believed in the power of community, and it's time we bring her dream to life. As she finished her presentation, a wave of silence enveloped the room. The board members exchanged glances, their expressions contemplative. Ava held her breath, waiting for their response. "Thank you for your passion and dedication, Ava," one of the board members said finally, breaking the silence. "Your vision is inspiring, and we can see how much this means to you and the community. We'd like to help." Ava's heart soared. "Really? You would support us?" "Yes," the board member replied with a smile. "We believe this project can make a significant impact. We'll work with you on securing funding and resources." Tears of gratitude welled in Ava's eyes as she nodded, overwhelmed by the support. "Thank you so much. You have no idea what this means to me and to Mrs. Carter's legacy." As she left the meeting, the sun shone brightly overhead, illuminating her path. Ava felt a renewed sense of hope and determination. She knew that this was just the beginning, but with the community behind her, she could make the vision of the community center a reality. However, she also knew she needed to confront Leo once more. The time had come to reconcile their differences and find a way to work together for Mrs. Carter's legacy. Ava took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. Later that afternoon, Ava arrived at the Carter house, her heart racing as she approached the door. She knocked gently, and Leo answered, his expression a mixture of surprise and wariness. "Ava," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "What's going on?" "I wanted to talk to you about the community center," Ava said, her voice steady. "I've just had a meeting with the nonprofit, and they're willing to support us." Leo's eyebrows raised in surprise. "That's great news, but I need you to be on board with this," Ava interjected, her gaze steady. "I understand that you're worried about finances, but this is about more than money. It's about honoring your mother's legacy and creating something meaningful for the community." Leo sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know I've been focused on selling the house, and I get that this is important to you, but I'm still not sure about keeping the house." "Leo, I get it. The house needs work, and maintaining it is a challenge," Ava said, choosing her words carefully. "But think of it as an investment in your mother's memory. The community center will not only honor her, but it could also bring people together in a way that would make her proud." He paused, his expression softening slightly. "What if we could use the funding from the nonprofit to cover the repairs? Would that make a difference for you?" "It would," Ava replied, her heart racing at the possibility. "If we can secure funding for the repairs, we can transform this place into something beautiful, something that embodies your mother's spirit." Leo's shoulders dropped as he considered her words. "Okay, let's work together on this. I want to honor Mom's memory too, but I need to know we're doing it right." Ava felt a rush of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Leo. I promise we'll make this work. We'll approach it as a partnership." As they sat down together, brainstorming ideas for the community center, Ava felt the weight of their previous tensions begin to lift. They discussed everything from program offerings to community outreach, and for the first time, it felt as though they were truly collaborating. Together, they made plans to organize a fundraiser to kick off the community center project. They reached out to local businesses for support and began to spread the word throughout the neighborhood. The excitement was palpable, and the sense of unity began to grow as more and more people expressed their enthusiasm for the center. In the following weeks, the community rallied around Ava and Leo's vision. They organized events to raise funds and awareness, and the response was overwhelmingly positive. People shared their stories of Mrs. Carter, celebrating her legacy in ways that brought tears to Ava's eyes. As the grand opening of the community center approached, Ava felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. They had transformed the once neglected house into a vibrant space filled with hope, laughter, and love. On the day of the opening, the atmosphere was electric. Ava stood at the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived, her heart swelling with pride. Leo stood beside her, a smile on his face as he welcomed familiar faces and new friends alike. As the ribbon was cut, a wave of applause filled the air. Ava looked around, taking in the joy that radiated from the crowd. This was the culmination of their hard work, a place where Mrs. Carter's spirit would continue to thrive. "Thank you all for being here today," Ava said, addressing the crowd. "This community center is a testament to the love and kindness that Mrs. Carter embodied throughout her life. Together, we can honor her legacy and create a space where we can all grow and support one another." Leo stepped forward, his expression sincere. "I want to thank Ava for her dedication and passion. You brought my mother's vision to life, and I'm grateful to everyone who has supported us along the way." As the crowd erupted in applause once more, Ava felt a rush of emotions. They had overcome challenges, faced fears, and built something beautiful in honor of Mrs. Carter. In that moment, she understood the true power of community, love, and resilience. Together, they had created a legacy that would endure, one that would continue to benefit others for years to come. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the newly opened center, Ava took a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought her here. She had fought for what was right, and she had found a way to honor the memory of a remarkable woman. And as she stood alongside Leo, surrounded by the laughter and joy of their community, Ava knew that they had forged a new beginning, not just for themselves, but for everyone whose lives would be touched by the community center. You've made it to the end. If you enjoyed this story, I am confident that you'll love the next one appearing on the screen now. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and please give this video a like. I'll see you in the next one.